Hello students, welcome to BBA 407 Strategic Management. In today's lecture, I will talk about strategy analysis and choice, mainly focusing on the space matrix, BCG matrix, and the grand strategy matrix. So these matrices are all in chapter 6. So starting with the space matrix, which is another important stage 2 matching tool as illustrated in figure 6.4. So as you can see in figure 6.4, the space matrix overall, it's a 4-quadrant framework which indicates whether organizations use aggressive, conservative, defensive, or competitive strategies. So this 4-quadrant framework, in other words, indicates whether aggressive, conservative, defensive, or competitive strategies are more appropriate for a given organization. So in order to create these strategies, we need to first know which indicators we should put on the X and Y axis of the 4-quadrant framework. So let's look at the financial position, which is FP. As you can see, FP is always positioned on the vertical positive, which is Y positive. Whereas the stability position, SP, is always positioned on the vertical negative, which is the Y negative axis. And then we have two other indicators, which is the competitive position and the industry position. And as you can see here, competitive position is always on the horizontal negative, meaning X negative, whereas the IP position is always the horizontal positive or X positive. IP position indicates or represents the industry position. Aggressive strategy is the intersection of FP and IP. Competitive strategy is the intersection of IP and SP. Defensive strategy is at the intersection of CP and SP, whereas the conservative strategy is at the intersection of FP and CP. But then how do we determine these intersection points? So please carefully listen to me and try to understand how I determine these intersection points, which will also determine the strategy that is most appropriate for the firm, because the firm will use either aggressive or competitive, defensive, or the conservative strategies. But before designing these strategies, we need to first put the indicators on the horizontal and the vertical axis. So here the matrix, let's look at the matrix, and this 4-quadrant framework, there are two internal dimensions, which are the financial position and the competitive position. And in addition to two internal dimensions, we have two external dimensions, which indicates the stability position and the industry position. So don't forget, two internal dimensions are always financial and competitive, whereas two external dimensions are always stability and the industry position. But again, I'm reminding you, it is very important that FP is always Y positive. SP is always Y negative. IP is always X positive. SP position is always X negative. So here are the factors that make up the space matrix axis. as summarized in Table 6.2, we will look at these factors that make up the space matrix axis. Only after listing these factors, we will be able to develop a space matrix. For instance, select a set of variables to define the financial position, FP. FP is always represented by return on investment, leverage, liquidity, cash flow, inventory turnover, earnings per share, and etc. Whereas look at the competitive position on the same column, which is SP. Competitive position is always determined by market share, product quality, product life cycle, customer loyalty, capacity utilization. Okay? And now look at the stability position, SP, which is measured by rate of inflation, price range of competing products, barriers to entry, technological changes, competitive pressures, price elasticity of demand. And then we also have the IP position, which is the industry, which all indicates the growth potential of the industry, financial stability, resource utilization, ease of entry into the market, productivity or capacity utilization within the industry. So in this table, I'm already giving you those factors that make up the space matrix axis. So you should know by looking at these factors, like where the FP position or where FP is positioned on the space matrix, or where SP is positioned on the space matrix. Is it positioned on X positive, X negative, Y positive, Y negative? You should know this in advance. Otherwise, you will not be able to construct the space matrix. Okay? So select a set of variables to define the financial position, competitive position, stability position, and the industry position. We have already done that. Okay? Those values are also given, so you don't have to assign those values. So while you're developing a space matrix, right, you will be assigning values to the indicators or the factors that make up the space matrix. For example, you will be assigning values to the financial position. You will be assigning values to the IP or competitive position. For instance, numerical value ranging from 1, worst, and 7, best, is always assigned to each of the variables that make up the FP and IP dimensions. So you have to give positive values to FP and IP. And these values can only be given to FP and IP. And the numerical values ranging -1, best, to -7, worst, is only assigned to variables that make up the SP and CP dimensions. Again, these values, -1 and -7, can only be assigned to SP and CP dimensions. And then you need to compute an average score for FP, CP, IP, and SP by summing the values given to the variables and dividing by the number of variables included in each dimension, right? So you're assigning an average score for FP. Whatever those scores are, generally those scores are given to you by the strategy firms. It is impossible for you to determine whether firm's financial position is +1 or +7. Those values will be given to you. Okay, but what you need to do is to compute an average score for each of the dimension. And you need to know how to find the average. You sum all the values given and divide by the number of variables or by the number of values. Okay? And then plot those average scores for FP, IP, SP, and CP on the appropriate axis in the space matrix. And then the next step is to add the two scores on the x-axis and plot the resultant on point X. And then add the two scores on the y-axis and plot the resultant point on Y. And then plot the intersection of the new XY point. Okay? And then draw a directional vector from the origin of the space matrix through the new intersection point. This vector reveals the type of strategies recommended for the organization, either aggressive, competitive, defensive, or conservative. You see, the intersection point in the case of aggressive profile is always the intersection of IP or FP, whereas the conservative profile is always the intersection of FP and CP. Again, you need to know where these profiles fall under in the space matrix. You need to know in advance where the aggressive profiles are positioned. It's always at the intersection of FP and IP. Again, the competitive profile is always at the intersection of IP and SP, right? Whereas the defensive profile is always at the intersection of CP and SP. After having finished the discussion on space matrix, let's now focus on the second matrix that I will be talking about, which is a BCG matrix. The biggest advantage of the BCG matrix is to allow us to develop firm profiles. It allows us to develop either firm profiles or different firm types. The BCG matrix graphically portrays differences among divisions of a firm in terms of relative market share and the industry growth rate. So there are two critical variables that you need to know in the BCG matrix. Two most essential or critical variables that you need to know is the firm's relative market share versus the industry's growth rate. For example, when we talk about firms' relative market share, let's say Apple's relative market share of the total industry sales, right? We're talking about the individual firm's market share vis-a-vis the total industry sales. And then when we talk about industry's growth rate, what we mean is the growth rate of Apple's industry. Apple's industry is IT, software, and technology, right? So industry's growth rate indicates whether industry is slow growing, sluggish, or fast growing. Let's say, is Apple's industry, which is the IT, software, and technology industry, is it a slow growing industry? Is it a fast growing industry? Is it stagnating? Is it sluggish? Those are the type of things that we talk about when we refer to industry's growth rate. So according to these two dimensions, we have four types of firm profiles. Four types of firm profiles. So the BCG matrix essentially allows us to develop firm profiles, which is shown in figure 6.4. So here we have the four quadrants, which represent the following, right? So there are four types of firms: question marks, stars, cash cows, and dogs. So there are four types of firms that we will be discussing about: question marks, stars, cash cows, and dogs. So let's define and explain and give an example for each type of firm. Okay? So what is a question mark firm? Question mark firm is the firm in quadrant 1, and they have a low relative market share position, yet they compete in a high growth industry. These question marks are also known as adopted children or wild dogs, right? Another term to describe these question mark firms are adopted children or wild dogs. So generally these firms, their cash needs are very high, but their cash generation is low. That's why we call them question mark, because we don't know the future of these firms. They have a very low market share, right? They're almost like infant firms, but they compete in a high growth industry. Question marks are growing rapidly and thus consume a large amount of cash because they have low market share, since they do not generate much cash. The result is a large net cash consumption. The overall result for the firm is a large net cash consumption. Again, also known as adopted children or wild dogs or infants, since it is a mystery or question whether, let's say, the diet food and soda industry will boom in the future, and whether PepsiCo's products will find their place or not. Therefore, Diet Pepsi, products like Diet Pepsi or Pepsi Max or Quaker fall under the question marks section of the PepsiCo's BCG matrix. I think these products are a very good example of products that are question marks for PepsiCo. Now let's look at the second type of firm or second type of product. So this doesn't have to, these firm profiles doesn't necessarily have to be firm profiles, right? They can also describe certain products of the firms. So the second type is stars, which is in the quadrant 2 of the BCG matrix. So these stars represents either businesses, firms, or products that represent the organization's best long-run opportunities for growth and profitability. These are the star firms. These are the best firms in the industry. These are the best firms or products because they have a very large or high market share, and they also compete in high growth industries. For instance, even though Pepsi's share in the market has been reduced to 8.4%, it is still the star product for PepsiCo because of its brand equity. It is one of the best well-known brands. Even though its market share is decreasing, it is still the star product, right? Other stars are Aquafina, biggest selling mineral water brand in the United States, or products like Tropicana, Gatorade, and Mountain Dew are examples of star products, which represent the organization's best long-run opportunities for growth and profitability. Okay? So now let's look at the cash cow firms or brands or products. These firms or products are positioned in quadrant 3 of the BCG matrix. Cash cows have a high market share, but compete in a low growth industry. Just like the star firms, these firms, they do have a relatively high market share, but this time they compete in a very low growth industry. They are called cash cows because they can generate cash in excess of their needs. That's why they can be milked to make further investments. That's why we call them cash cows. They can produce cash in excess of their needs. For instance, think about the market share of Frito-Lay, which is a product or brand for PepsiCo, right? With a market share of 58.8% in the United States, Frito-Lay is the biggest cash cow for PepsiCo. I think Frito-Lay is a very good example of these cash cow brands which generate a very high relative market share but also compete in a low growth industry. And the last one, we have the dogs. The dogs are the firms or the brands in the quadrant 4 of the BCG matrix. Okay, these firms are the products of the organization which have a low market share, but also they compete in a slow or almost no growth industry. I mean, dogs are essentially poorest performers, right? They're really in a bad position. Not only they are losing money, but they're also competing in a slow growth or no growth industry, right? Think about, for instance, seasonal and experimental products like Pepsi Real Sugar, right? Or the firms in financial difficulty like Sears, Kmart, right? They have poor profits, they are the poorest performers, they don't have enough cash. In, for instance, 2018, Sears was the 34th first largest retail in the United States. However, after several years of declining sales, its parent company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on October 15, 2018. Sears announced on January 16, 2019 that it had won its bankruptcy auction and would shrink and remain open with 425 stores. As you can imagine, this is a firm that declared bankruptcy. It was in difficult financial position. It was on shaky grounds. It somehow was able to win the bankruptcy auction and shrink its or shut down its branches and would still remain open. But this is really a poor performing company that should be liquidated, in fact, right? Most of these companies are often liquidated, divested, or trimmed down through retrenchment, like it happened to Sears. The major benefit of the BCG matrix is that it draws attention to the cash flow, investment characteristics, and needs of an organization's various divisions. So now let's focus on the last topic of this lecture, which is the grand strategy matrix. In addition to the SWOT matrix, space matrix, and the BCG matrix, the grand strategy matrix has become a very popular tool for formulating alternative strategies. Okay, it has become very useful and popular for formulating strategies that are sort of unorthodox and alternative. Okay? So it uses two evaluative dimensions: competitive position and the market growth. Okay? Two dimensions: competitive positions and the market growth. All organizations can be positioned in one of the grand strategy matrix's four quadrant framework. Okay? The grand strategy matrix is pictured in figure 6.13. As I said, it is based on two evaluative dimensions: competitive position and market growth. Okay? Quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. Okay? So let's go over these quadrants one by one. Okay? Firms located in quadrant 1 of the grand strategy are in excellent strategic position. For example, they have a strong competitive position in a fast-growing industry. Okay? For instance, companies like Apple, Google, Facebook are good examples of the quadrant 1 firm, which have excellent strategic and competitive position. Firms positioned in quadrant 2, however, they need to evaluate their present approach to the marketplace because they have a weak competitive position in a fast-growing market. So in other words, these firms in a way are going out of style and feel the need to come back. They have a weak competitive position. They're still surviving, but they have a weak competitive position because they're unable to compete effectively. Okay? If there is a way to turn around the company, it is indeed possible to bring back the company or the brand. Okay? So examples for companies in quadrant 2 framework is Levi Strauss, right? Levi Strauss's most popular brand is Levi's jeans. Levi's 501 used to be a very popular brand in the late 1980s, early 1990s, right? But over time, Levi's has been unable to compete effectively with new brands emerging in the jeans market. So our recommended strategy for the firm is to determine why the firm's current approach is ineffective and how the company can best change to improve its competitiveness. And quadrant 3, we have organizations that compete in slow growth industries and also have a weak competitive position. Okay, so basically firms in quadrant 3, they are poor performers. Not only they have a weak competitive position in the sense that they're unable to compete effectively with the rivals, they are in slow growth industries. With the slow growth, the industry is very close to saturation, and there aren't any new customers getting attracted to a firm's products. Only drastic measures, adjustment, and changes will be able to save such companies and prevent further demise or impending liquidation. The firm should have no choice but to implement drastic measures, adjustment, or changes to turn around the company. Companies that are poor performers or declared bankruptcy at some point in time or came back with restructuring or retrenchment fall in this category of quadrant 3. Companies like Sears, Barney's, Fairway, Kmart are good examples of quadrant 3 companies that are poor performers. These companies really need extensive cost and asset reduction, meaning retrenchment, to be able to come back. Again, companies like Sears, Barney's, Fairway, Kmart are examples of quadrant 3 companies or poor performers in grand strategy matrix. In the quadrant 4 framework, we have businesses or companies that have strong competitive position, but they're in a slow growth industry. Okay, so in other words, these companies can compete effectively, but its industry is not growing well. It's a sluggish or stagnant growth industry. The best example for quadrant 4 firms are the firms in the airlines industry. I think airlines industry is a very good example for the quadrant 4 businesses. Think about the partnership between KLM and Northwestern Airlines, right? The partnership or the joint venture between KLM and Northwest Airlines is a good example of quadrant 4 businesses. Their joint venture gives them an advantage in the form of sharing landing rights purchasing, catering, and sharing overhead costs. In this lecture, I talk about the grand strategy matrix, the BCG matrix, and the space matrix. In the next part of my lecture, meaning part 3, I will talk about the